So, welcome to Parallax Lectures. I'm your host, Thomas Mark. Thank you all for showing up. This is a fairly new format, so let's see how that goes. That's the fourth lecture we have. You can visit our platform, our website, for updates, interviews, podcasts, and I just posted the link in the chat box. So tonight, my guest is Daniel Görtz. He's a sociologist and philosopher, and as a co-author as Hanzi Freinacht from the Listening Society and the Nordic Ideology. Hanzi, are you there?
Hello,
Daniel?
there. Good to see you, Tom.
How are you? Mir geht's good, and I'm fairly well. And you?
Frankly, on the subjective scale of states, I'm on a 7. From 1 to 13.
So
yeah, I mean, anytime we're on a 7, we should be grateful. Life hasn't brought us greater suffering. Let's see if this talk and lecture can bring my subjective states to soar. Anyways.
Thank you very much that you're doing that, so that you took the time, and we had planned to do the conference in Germany, and that didn't work out, sadly, so because of Corona and other things. So now we're doing this. I'm very grateful for that, and to give you the platform to talk about your great ideas and all of that. So you're working on your third book?
It's called 6 Hidden Patterns of History. So it's a book on world history, particularly on the Metamemes, the great connecting patterns that aren't necessarily periods in history, but can help us analyze how history has developed and evolved.
Right. So how far are you?
It depends on how you mean by far. So especially my co-author Emil has been putting a lot of work into this. He's the historian, but we've fairly recently redefined how we want to write the book in dialogue format, namely Q and HF, Hanzi Freinacht. So actually we're a little bit starting from the beginning, but it's been a lot of fun thus far.
Right. Okay. So what do you want to talk about
today? I want to talk about a number of very, very important distinctions about what people mean when they use the word metamodernism. People mean very, very different things. And metamodernism, I feel, in many ways is crippled for this particular reason, that we're, chasing our own tail a lot of the time and don't know what we're talking about.
Right.
So hopefully this lecture will help to bring some specificity and clarity into that discussion. And that's the aim.
Perfect.
The lecture is based on a chapter that is coming up in a Metamodern reader. It's going to be called something else. They changed the title several times, but there are chapters by a lot of prominent scholars of the field, and there's going to be one by Hanzi Freinacht, which is titled Metamodern Sociology. And in that chapter, there is also a definition of the term metamodernism, or some distinctions to this definition. So that's where this is coming from.
Right, perfect. Okay, so for all you listeners, how that works, Daniel will do 30, 40 minutes lecture. Is that more or less what you're aiming for? We'll chat a little bit about this, and then we'll open the floor for the participants, and I will make them active participants so they can turn on the camera and ask their questions and go into dialogue with you. And I hope that will be a lively and interesting thing. So I make you now the co-host, so you because you have some slides and you want to. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So now you're the host, and you can go ahead.
Wonderful. Sharing screen. This one. Slideshow from the beginning. What is metamodernism? Learning to make important distinctions. And I hope to stress that these are in fact important distinctions, that I'm not just shuffling around words here, that we have this vast movement of interconnected things, some of which call themselves metamodern and others that don't at all or don't even know about the term, but they are somehow connected. So we'll dive into this and give a few different definitions of what metamodernism is. So the first one is to claim it's a cultural phase. So postmodernism has been around in society. I should mention, by the way, this lecture is a little bit less introductory than our former discussions have been, Tom. So so this is for a somewhat more well, advanced audience who might already know a bit about the topic or have some preconceptions. And the first is that it's a cultural phase. So there has been, well, a lot of ink has been spilled around this topic of postmodernism, the ironic detachment from modern society, the deconstruction of its meaning structures, the critical gaze of humanities and social sciences, discourse analysis, revealing power structures, taking a linguistic turn. Many of these things, feminism is connected to this in many ways, academic feminism anyway, and as are things, of course, within the arts and in post-colonial theory. There are so many things that are loosely connected to this large structure called postmodernism. And the idea is that after postmodernism, something else has been happening. Something has shifted in culture, in popular culture, in the arts, in academia, in philosophical discourses. So there has been a cultural phase shift. And if we look then at the term metamodernism, that's one of the suggestions for what comes after postmodernism. That it's a cultural phase, a fairly recent one, where the irony of and detachment and critique of the postmodern sentiment has shifted. And you have brought in hope and naivety and progress in a certain sense, albeit all the time oscillating back to this postmodern irony. And this has been observed in the arts and in architecture, even by Vermeulen and van der Acker, to Dutch scholars and cultural theorists who really did a lot to popularize this term and give it new meaning and weight academically and also culturally speaking. Alison Gibbons is active in that same space. And there's literary scholars like Alexandra Dumitrescu, who has analyzed literature. There are a few books that particularly seem to capture this metamodern essence. So Infinite Jest, of course, is a title that comes up a lot here. And it's called a metamodern novel. Greg Dember and Linda Cerello have analyzed popular culture in TV shows and a lot of other things and looked for this new trend, like this new sincerity showing up. Luke Turner is an artist himself, but he wrote Metamodernist Manifesto, a short, poetic, inspiring piece that highlights these topics, that it's an oscillation, that there is informed naivety, that there is magical realism, and so on. So there is a kind of both and thinking then of modernity and its naive belief in progress and the truth, and postmodernity with its skepticism towards these. And it takes many different expressions across culture. And in this sense, it is metamodernism is an alternative to other phases of that cultural theorists and analysts have proposed. Postmodernism is one. We needn't dig into these. Digimodernism is another one. Transmodernism, that one goes a little bit in the direction of being a new philosophy. We'll get back to that perhaps. Performativism also perhaps goes in the direction a little bit more of being a philosophy. But all of these encapsulate that somehow there is something new going on. Internet society has some new cultural dynamics which were not seen earlier, and which should be viewed as distinct from what we have learned to recognize as postmodernism in our culture, and that there are more and more of these expressions, and certain cultural logics that come with these expressions, certain cultural logics of how Seth Abramson could be mentioned in this context also. He particularly looks at the cultural logic of the internet age. For instance, how can Donald Trump get away with saying different things than other presidents? Clearly something has shifted in the cultural dynamics of society. So that's the most widespread use of metamodernism, and also the term metamodernism, and also the one most academically established, I should say. Now, other people have other ideas. More things seem to be going on and happening after postmodernism, after postmodernity, which brings us to this one. It's a developmental stage of society. So I put Wilber's integral theory here. I put Habermas, not because he talks about metamodernism, but because Habermas, the great social theorist of Europe, does in his discourse on modernity, philosophical discourse on modernity, track stages of development of societies and argues that they have different certain logics. Günter Dux has done a different, taken a different path or view of this. Also, great German sociologist, many big books have been written about him and his work. And he bases it on particularly Piaget's the developmental theory, psychological developmental theory. So the idea here is that society itself is shifting towards something completely different, and all of its institutions are likely to profoundly change, and the logics of how we govern our countries, of how the economy is organized, and so on, shift. Particularly, a very important key element here is that we're entering into internet society with a host of other super technologies, of course. But the metamodernism in this sense is something different than just a cultural phase. It corresponds more to modernity, not to modernism as an arts period, and then postmodernism as another arts period, but more like modernity, going back even to the Renaissance, up to the Industrial Revolution, up to liberal democracy, and fully blooming in liberal democracy. That is modernity, and postmodernity is the kind of society that comes after capitalist liberal democracy. So there's a lot more to say about that. I should go on. But that's an enormously important distinction to be made, and it causes a lot of confusions, especially for the people who subscribe to this first view, and they hear a lot of people such as myself talking about a whole new society. and they feel, well, maybe they're beating a much too big drum. But I don't think we are, actually. I think there are good reasons to believe that society is shifting in such profound and wide-reaching manners that that we can indeed and should indeed be thinking about what this new stage of society looks like. And this is both an exploratory work, explore what this new stage could look like, and it's a normative work, meaning, or a prescriptive work, because there's a logic to how the stages develop. So it says something about what the new stage should look like. More on this perhaps later. No, it's a metameme, says the third voice. And the third voice says something quite similar to it's a stage in society, but a bit more abstract, or a lot more abstracted. It's not the particular society. That first society is modern, then it is postmodern, then it becomes metamodern. Rather, there have been throughout history large sets of memes, of interconnected memes or memeplexes, and these we can call metamemes. And they have an inherent logic that connect the different events and processes in them. And each of these are a kind of cultural generator function, which asserts itself first within certain aspects of certain parts of society and spreads from there, and spreads a new cultural logic. So, I mean, we saw, if you read, for instance, Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, he describes how human beings, Homo sapiens, outcompeted other human species by virtue of communicating in larger groups around larger imagined worlds. And this was in fact animism, the fact that you could gather a fairly large group of people around a totem, around a spiritual practice, and so on, and around a larger narrative. So even though Homo sapiens were physically inferior in the European climate and so on, they could outcompete the less culturally endowed Neanderthals, and on it went with actually all of the other 5 species of humans, and all were subsumed by Homo sapiens. So even the first one of these metamemes is incredibly powerful. Well, the list goes on. Eventually, we have sedimentary societies with agriculture, and a new metameme kicks into place, which I've called Faustianism, or we have called Faustianism. And we call it that way because you kind of make a deal with the devil that you get power gods, you get well, a certain kind of detachment from nature, and humanity becomes society detached from nature, and can create its own structures, and thus can build more grander basis of power and fulfill different desires and needs for greatness. Post-Faustianism is the critique of that crude world. So it's when Christianity, for instance, comes to the Vikings and Christians the Vikings, and their former religion is deemed paganism. And post-Faustianism, of course, includes a critique of sheer power. Rather, the king should be ruling because it's God's reign, or that it's a divine right, something like that. And it all points towards a universal truth. This logic is brought to its endpoint at one point or another, and in comes modernism, which says, well, if there is a universal truth and if we are all equal, we should all be able to check that universal truth for ourselves. And what happens is, of course, that you have a scientific revolution and all that follows from it. Postmodernism is the critique of modern society, picks that apart, shows that the power structures are still there, that we aren't in fact equal, that our societies aren't actually rational and democratic, that human beings aren't rational. And yeah, there's a whole thread there. And metamodernism comes in as a pattern that emerges from the postmodern elements of society and starts to reconstruct modernism and postmodernism, but also including elements of all of the former metamemes. So these are abstracted patterns. So looking at modernism, for instance, you can't pin it down to one particular society or one particular period, because modernism as a metameme begins in the arts. So it begins in Renaissance art, when you get things like in the Italian Renaissance, for instance, you get perspective, and like that, the natural world is detached from the social universe. So from that very move to view the world objectively, to view it so in a way so that anyone can check for themselves from a third-person view, a view from nowhere, as it were, then all of the other modern institutions follow through the development of a capitalist economy and a socialist alternative to it, to the development of liberal democracy and full suffrage and so on, and human rights and a liberal world order. So that's the same metameme, but it's not stretched over a very short period. It's over 500 years. And in the midst of that, of the growth of the former metameme, at the very top of modernity, you have the birth of a postmodern critique, starting also first in the arts, long before you had postmodern philosophers like Foucault. You had art that could, in this sense, be deemed postmodern, because it critiques perspective, for instance, when Picasso does so very consciously, for instance. Well, so a theorist that can be mentioned that has done similar work before and viewed the world similarly to these metamemes would be Jean Gebser. He's looking for these deep patterns that underlie history and organize it. And he also notices that there are different logics that, well, one begets the other, and there is a clear sequence to them. So also here, comparing to viewing metamodernism as a phase in our current culture, views it more writ large, that has a bigger and more profound shift, and which we're at the very beginning of them. Well, then there's fourth answer to the question, what is metamodernism? So it's a rare stage of psychological development. And that the idea here is that people develop as human beings in our values, in our worldview, in our personalities, in our perspective taking, in our sensibilities, and they become modern first and get a modern worldview. Maybe when you were in high school, you had more of a mainstream worldview yourself. I certainly did, and I had a more materialist view of life, and and many other things. Modernism is connected to such things as meritocracy, achievement, fair and free competition, for instance, rationality, expression through achievement, expression of the self through achievement. Before that stage, you have a stage that more corresponds to traditional societies, that where you more try to fit in, you try to follow the values of your society and so on. You're trying to find one truth and stick with it. And on it goes, that after the modern stage of development, you might see something like a postmodern stage of development, or something that would correspond to it, where you can take many different perspectives. You view yourself more as a relational being. You value relationships more. You question the values of your society, and whether or not it's a fair and free society, and so on. And metamodernism would be the subsection of those often fairly privileged and educated and people who become postmodernists, who takes up a more self-developmental view, seeing that we develop together, that I am in flux, that every one of us is profoundly affected by the situations we are in. So one becomes more concerned with co-development, and like, I help you develop so that you can help me develop, and you begin to focus on processes and how, much more how and when than the actual what. So there's a sequence of developmental stages, and the different sequences are presented by a number of different scholars. So you have Robert Keegan suggesting a bunch of theories that largely that can largely be compared to this one that I have sketched. You have Susanne Cook-Greuter, who has done a lot of work on similar theories, could consider a lot less academically kosher for different reasons. You have Michael L. Commons, who has been a mentor of my own, who particularly just studies the complexity of someone's thinking, and also notice these stages. And he's a neo-Piagetian, so these Piagetian stages that we go through as kids, where our perspective and our cognition shifts, they continue into adulthood, is his argument, and also what his research shows. And they can also be compared to these different stages, right? And there are other names that could be mentioned: Michael Baschitz, Kurt Fischer, Theo Dawson, Terry Fallon, Claire Graves, Gerald Young. Not all of them would buy the exact or maybe none of them would buy this simplified model that I have presented, which builds a bit more of a caricature image of these stages. But there is a rich plethora of research, and they seem to be pointing in the same direction, that later stages are more nuanced, more multi-perspectival, and less identified with the self. And metamodern, then, in this sense, a lot of people will talk about, is this person metamodern? Is that person metamodern? Maybe a while ago, it was more popular to say somebody is postmodern, or they are integral in their perspective, or they're modernist or postmodernist or integral in their perspective. And nowadays, a lot of people have shifted that word, integral, in terms of a psychological stage, to metamodernism, or to metamodern. So this person is metamodern in their perspective. And people who recognize each other as being of this stage will try to find each other and interact, because they find they have much more in common, for instance. So that's a fourth definition of metamodernism, a psychological stage of development, and a fairly rare one, as I said, likely under 1% of the population if you're a little more stringent in the definitions. No. It's a certain paradigm with its own philosophy. Well, so this is important, that a lot of people, when they say metamodern, actually mean the philosophical engine that seems to be connected to this metameme, to this cultural shift, and so on. And there are interesting shifts that have happened in philosophy lately. I tried to grab 6 of them here and highlight them, but they're by no means the only possible compilation. But there is something like a profound shift of worldview which afflicts certain people, and then they change their view of life, reality, and themselves, and ethics, and society in an abstract but profound way. Well, basically, your philosophy of life shifts. Your basic philosophical prepositions shift. So that's a 5th one. So what are these? Well, what are these elements? As I said, 6 suggestions here, and they should be viewed as interconnected. So the first is complexity. A lot of metamodern perspectives live close to complexity science, to studies of autopoiesis, of self-organization in nature, of the interaction of many loose agents who together create patterns which are unlikely to emerge in other contexts. And there is a view that unlike more postmodern philosophy, you don't view the world necessarily in terms of structures and power structures so much. Rather, you tend to view them as different complex interactions which have often unexpected consequences, and both desirable and undesirable. So it also points towards a less black and white kind of view of the world, which also makes it more difficult from this philosophical perspective to take a very strong position on the classical political scale, etc. Going on from there, we have a second element, perspectivalism or perspectivism, which basically says that, well, whoever has the most perspectives when they die wins. That in metamodern philosophy and the metamodern paradigm always tries to climb out of whatever perspectives I happen to have at the moment and view the world with other perspectives. The perspectives of people with other paradigms and other worldviews, the perspectives of other ethnicities, other social groups, other sciences, other disciplines, and these together create a rich plethora of perspectives, which are nevertheless not arbitrarily ordered, because you have a perspective of the perspectives. So you see them more as emergent properties in interaction with each other. And the issue with this kind of philosophy often becomes to focus on the emergence, where we get to the 3rd one, the emergence and processes that lead up to these perspectives. And no perspective is entirely wrong. There's always a reason that somebody thinks something, even even a schizophrenic nightmare or a conspiracy theory or anything else. There's always something to understand, always a partial truth. Well, you get to a deeper truth then by comparing as many perspectives as possible and getting the best possible meta theory or meta perspective, but through which we can compare them. We're always building this meta perspective. The third one was emergence and processes. So this, of course, builds us behooves us to always want to focus on the best possible processes for truth-seeking, for sense-making, and so on. So you can recognize metamodern philosophy in this, that it will look for not necessarily a stable truth. It views the world as full of flows and always events, always occurrences, always in flux. And for this reason, it tries to understand and see how these processes and flows can be reorganized and resonate better together in a greater wholeness, so to speak. Developmental stages, then. Yes, I mean, some people would argue against me here that this one has to be part of metamodern philosophy, and I guess it's true of all of them that among metamodern thinkers or people who are part of this paradigm in one way or another, that you'll find maybe 70% like them and 30% don't, often for very good reasons. So the reasons not to like ideas about developmental stages is, of course, they can lead to judgmental stuff, that you think of yourself as a higher stage than others. They can lead to closing down on truly taking multiple perspectives, and you can also misalign this or misconstrue the stages, and that can lead to catastrophe. For instance, if you believe that capitalist society inevitably collapses into a socialist one through a revolution, you've made a false stage theory, and if you act according to that stage theory, then bad consequences will come out of it. So you also raise the stakes a lot when you try to implement developmental perspectives. But the counter-argument to that is that, well, if we do accept the postmodern multi-perspectivalism and a critique of any one great truth out there, then we have already introduced a kind of stage theory. We're already saying that the postmodern critique stems from modernity and modernism, and that in a sense that it is a higher stage. So it is actually less arrogant to argue that there are several stages, and that there were several stages before modernity, and that there will be later stages which will shred whatever philosophy is being born in this day and age to bits. And that a lot of people won't be able to pick up on that. And that there will be clashes of different paradigms and philosophies again. Transpersonal perspective is very important. So if we do view the world as full of complexity, many perspectives, in emergence and always in processes, climbing different developmental stages depending on how you define them, it also, there's not that much left of the self. So when we look inwards with this kind of philosophy, we see there's nobody home. There's no self left. And because, hey, here I am in complex co-emergence with the rest of you. And so there's no clear boundary between you and me. We still have to set up such boundaries for the sake of social functionality and cohesion. And of course, I still have my body and you have yours. But in terms of ideas and interactions and actions and agency and life courses, we develop together. And we are multi-layered, each of us. So you can affect me by means of, I don't know, a smart attention-grabbing mechanism on my iPhone or whatever, and get me to do something I'm not aware of why I'm doing. So my agency can come from you, and at the same time, I can find another way to manipulate you, or we can bust each other's shadows, or we can bring each other into higher spiritual states and whatnot. The point is, we've dissolved the I. We're individuals, and we evolve together. And this brings us actually to the last of these philosophical propositions, fractality. That metamodern philosophy, or the metamodern paradigm, this meaning of the term, it closely relates to fractals in many ways, because when you zoom in on anything, you tend to not find an essence. You zoom in on the left and the right, for instance, in politics. Well, there's going to be left and the right within the left and the right. And if you examine these parts closely, you're going to notice that the left within the right often has a lot more in common with the left, with the left of the left than with the right of the right, and so on. There are going to be so many connections that you can't place on a simple scale, like the two-dimensional scale of Galtan, for instance, those little maps of ideological positioning. Rather, it's full of loopholes. It's full of, the world doesn't consist of flat planes. It consists of donuts. You zoom in on one thing and you notice that, aha, what's really going on is that there is some underlying pattern, for instance, a metameme, and you zoom in on it, new self-similar things emerge, but they emerge in new ways. And this goes throughout all of the things we've talked about. So fractality applies to complexity, to perspectivism. Certainly you find perspectives within perspectives and they resemble each other and so on. So we are opening up this large fractal space where we're not taking a certain position within the fractal, we're learning to traverse the fractal of our understanding of the world together. Anyway, that's in a nutshell metamodern philosophy, and that's the fifth way people use this term, which shouldn't be confused with a developmental stage, for instance. So how are we doing on time? One moment. Yes, I think I can go for a moment more. Here we go from the current slide. The sixth meaning, then, it's a movement. So metamodernism is also something happening out there in the world, and this is also what people mean when they say the term metamodernism. And there's a connecting thread throughout all of these different movements. Reconstruction follows deconstruction. So if postmodernism critiqued the world, critiqued the modern world, that is, critiqued its injustices, critiqued its inconsistencies, its loopholes, its cracks in the wall, and its exceptions, and so on. It always ends on a question mark. It always asks further questions. This was also what was deliberately said what was literally said by Foucault, who once he had been critiquing everything, and once he was asked, as the great postmodern philosopher he was, well, you're just against everything. What do you want? And he said, you know what? There are so many engineers and economists in the world who are busy trying to organize the world. I just want to pick it apart. And that kind of encapsulates the core essence. No, we don't believe in essences after postmodernists, but a core principle of the postmodern endeavor, and also of the postmodern sentiment. Now, we've already seen in the first of these definitions in the phase that we're reintroducing magical realism, informativity, a kind of a kind of sincere irony, a new hope in a way. And all the while knowing that we, after all, are probably mistaken, and yet we have to try because, hey, we're here to play. And there's this playful element. So I'm going to list a few different things which I feel are connected through this common thread, and things that are postmodern in a sense then. Well, one thing is, of course, the book, The Listening Society, by Hanzi Freinacht, which tries to reconstruct the welfare state and say, hey, we can construct a new layer of politics, a new form of politics. We could look at other and deeper issues of what it means to grow as a human being, for instance, through the stages of growth. Maybe emphasizing things like psychological well-being, existential health, the quality of relationships, and making these top political concerns. In many ways, post-capitalism falls under this, is under this umbrella as well, because what many metamodern, movements will and settings and groups will try to do is not just be against capitalism. They won't necessarily try to view it as something dark or sinister or like a grim power structure. They will try to create alternatives to it through commenting, through redefining how companies are organized, through policy proposals, through new business models, through studying the dynamics of internet economy and seeing how cultural capital and informational capital takes a greater and greater role. There are also aesthetic expressions. We mentioned that also in the first one, and we talked about the arts. But you have many, many different aesthetic expressions in Burning Man culture and solar punk, etc., which try to reconstruct a utopian image of the future, which is nevertheless playful and ironically held, which is at the crossroads of fact and fiction, another metamodern slogan. Co-development. So you have all of these groups gathering around Europe and the US and many other places, I suppose, who experiment with new ways of meeting up and seeing what emerges in the room to put ego issues and preconceptions to the side and try to create the best possible processes for something interesting to emerge in the interaction itself, so that the interaction also becomes transformational for the person who participates. So this is a very important theme, I suppose, in all of these movements, co-development. You'll find it in the artistic expressions, in the post-capitalist and commenting projects, in the listening society, of course, and it's kind of politics. And you also have different forms of secularized religion and democratized religion and spirituality. So religion and spirituality, which kind of were thrown out with the baby, as a baby with the bathwater and under modernity, and never truly fully reconquered under a postmodern critique thereof, even though we have plenty of postmodern Buddhists and so on. There is an attempt to recreate these things, create new rituals, new co-created rituals, to create an embodied sense of what metamodernism means, not necessarily with that using that term, but this is an important element as well, there are many examples. For instance, syntheism as a movement, creating God in the internet age, is a book that works in this direction. Well, you have also, of course, movements to transform organizations and governance. The Governance of Organizations, a very popular book. Reinventing Organizations talks about teal organizations. Teal is then a color code for a developmental stage of organizations, which would correspond to metamodern. So you have all of those things going on. That's also kind of reconstruction, follows deconstruction. We have criticized the modern society. Now we're going to reconstruct the organizations within which we live our work lives. Oftentimes it's a marriage then of the personal, the political, and the professional, and these are reintegrated in new ways. They were differentiated under modernity, and now they are reintegrated. It's often a risky business. And then I should mention that these movements tend to stem from the Triple H populations: hipsters, hackers, and hippies. So hipsters are rich on cultural capital. They're really the embodiment of the creative class, and they are also rich on understanding, well, maybe a lot of book learning and so on, and find ways of using these things transformationally in the world. But they hook up increasingly with hackers. I'm no exception there. I'm a hipster, I guess you could say, in this denomination, and I work with a community in Silicon Valley at something called the One Project, who are experts at building software. And I worked formerly also at an IT company as in-house philosopher. And then you have the hippies, of course, people who are good at meditation, all the somatic therapies, and so on. And this shows up a lot, also psychedelic practices, of course. This shows up a lot in Burning Man culture, which is also naturally connected to the arts, hipster, and Silicon Valley culture, hackers. So these are important. When you put these three together, you kind of have the nexus of where all of these movement things are bubbling up and occurring and emerging, and where, for instance, the metamodern philosophy is, or different forms of metamodern philosophy are more likely to take hold. And you might add a fourth age. So you expand it from triple H to quadruple H population, the Hermetics. So the Hermetics are people who are very interested in symbols and the occult, and in games often, and in rituals, and they're good at inventing these. And they provide a kind of temple building, which is instrumental actually in many ways for the others to gather and work together. Not least if we are to create new religion and spirituality. So that kind of encapsulates where we're at as a metamodernist movement. And on the surface, it doesn't look like a movement because it's so widespread. It just points in all directions. But on the other hand, if you look at it more closely, you see, yes, Reconstruction follows deconstruction. These people tend to like each other. They tend to understand each other. They tend to be connected in some way, network-wise, not least. So yes, it is a movement, just doesn't look like movements usually have done historically. It's a more complex movement, but the metamodernism is also a movement. And that's another distinction that should be made and not be confused with metamodernism as philosophy, as a developmental stage, and so on. Conclusion. So it is what Sean Esbjørn Hargens in 2010, writing about climate change at that point, has termed multiple ontological object. Metamodernism is a multiple ontological object, meaning that you imagine a bunch of circles, a very weird Venn diagram, and not all of these are going to intersect. We should view it as the sum of all of those circles. That's metamodernism, and that's the most useful way to use the term. And then we can nimbly go back and forth between these 6 meanings, and perhaps others that can come up that are meaningful. nevertheless, we should integrate these meanings, and we should work across them and back and forth, and let them cross-pollinate and so on. But we shouldn't be stuck in one meaning, and we shouldn't fight the other meanings. That's, I guess, my main argument. And most of all, we shouldn't confuse these meanings with one another, then we're wasting our own time and the time of one another. I could end there. I'll say a few more words. Combining now these six meanings: phase, societal stage, psychological stage, metameme, philosophy, and movement. It's easy to see that sometimes something is metamodern in one or two of these, in the sense of one or two, but not all of them. So for instance, you can have a person who subscribes to metamodern philosophy, but isn't at a metamodern stage of personal development. You can have a political leader like Donald Trump who partakes in some of the metamodern cultural dynamics that are playing out in society, but isn't, of course, by themselves as a person metamodern at all, or would rather be an antithesis of it. You can have a metamodern expression within the arts and the popular culture, which isn't nominally metamodern and doesn't call itself metamodern, is completely not tied to the metamodern movement, or on it goes. You can have a metamodern person of metamodern stage of development, which nevertheless doesn't have anything to do with the rest of these things. And that also brings more texture to the picture, and I hope more clarity. That'll be all for this. I'll stop the share so we can have a conversation.
Perfect. Daniel, thank you a lot for your talk. That was fantastic. It was very dense, and I will soon open up the panel for all these participants. While I'm doing this, so let me just ask, are there something like metamodern morals?
I wouldn't necessarily say metamodern morals. So the value memes, or actually, oh yeah, that's a distinction we could have made. The value memes vis-a-vis the
I want one thing. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you make me the host again so I can?
Oh yes, of course. How do I do that?
You go on participants, and there you can see me.
Participants.
You move over my name and you
make host. Yes.
Perfect. So again, metamodern morals. Mm-hmm.
Yes, metamodern morality or morals. So first of all, depending, of course, on which of these meanings we look at, the answers are going to be different. If you look at something like the phase, just metamodernism as a phase, cultural phase, the answer would likely be no, actually, not necessarily. But if we look at metamodernism as philosophy, or as a cultural stage of development, or a societal stage of development, or a metameme, it's possible to say yes. We should mention, though, that morality tends to develop particularly in the space of the soft metamemes. Modernity largely inherited the post-Faustian morality. You should be against slavery, you shouldn't kill people, the person who governs should do so for good reason, and many other things. But the point is that we're all equal in the eyes of God, of course. But the point is that modernity didn't invent a whole new morality. It just made real the morality that had just been in the clouds, as it were, or a beacon on the hill under post-Faustianism. So in traditional societies, religions would be against war, or at least against unnecessary killing and so on. But it wasn't until modernity showed up that you actually got liberal democracies who actually don't go to war with each other, and who actually ban slavery and so on. The same kind of goes for metamodernism. It builds on the postmodern ethics, which says stuff like, hey, we should turn around the alienation felt in modern society. We should make society sustainable ecologically. We should care about other species than human beings. We should we should be critical of the inequalities or excessive inequalities of our society. And of course, on the far end of postmodernism, we also have an inclusion of animal rights. You should be including animals in your ethical concerns. So all of these are inherited right into metamodernism, and the issue rather is that metamodernism is likely to make these things more real. They're not just going to be minority voices or critiques. They're going to actually saturate society. So the metamodern promise in terms of morality is to substantiate the promises made of the postmodern critique. All of those things that were formerly situated in, I guess you could say, an ivory tower of critique, and always kind of a guilty conscience, like the intellectuals, the postmodern intellectuals would be kind of like the priesthood of modernity, just like the priesthood of post-Faustianism was the priesthood of agricultural societies, always giving us guilty conscience and stuff. That's kind of what the critique, particularly on the left, has been. Now we're going to make it more than a critique, we're going to make it real. So that's an important aspect. If we do go take the philosophy seriously enough, though, and we follow through with the metamodern philosophy to its endpoint, we do end up with a fractal ethics. And the fractal ethics coordinates the four different key components of meta-ethics that are taught in philosophy classes. So that would be the social contract, virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and deontology or ethics by principle. So right now these are competing, but if you apply the fractal philosophy and you make a fractal ethics, you can actually get a code that will help you improve your ethical engine, as it were, and the ethical engine of society. So that's a promise of metamodernism, hopefully going to be a future Hanzi book. That would be the fifth book in the Hanzi series, if all goes well.
Right. So does anybody else wants to participate or does have a question? Now is the chance to do so. Do you hear me and can you talk? Perfect. Okay. So you mentioned deontology, like by principle. So how about teleology? Isn't there a mixture always? And try to find an equilibrium between those two principles of ethics?
Well, so yeah, that brings up a quite dense discussion, and one which I don't have clearly in my mind, because it leads to a fairly advanced Sudoku, where you have to put these four forms of ethics on Wilber's four quadrants, and then you have to zoom in on each of them, and then you have to see how each of them contain all of the others. But just saying a few basics, deontology and utilitarianism have to coexist, for the simple reason that the utilitarian, once you have established the principle, greatest possible benefit and the least possible suffering for the greatest possible number, is still a deontologist. He or she has to just affirm that that ethical claim religiously. So all rationality and all calculation follows from that first principle. And that first principle is not in itself utilitarian. That first principle is a deontological principle. So that's just one way of showing their interconnectedness.
Right.
Yeah, questions welcome.
Yeah, it's more of a comment, and well, you can say what you think about it. So I've heard the claim that all ethics evolve towards rule utilitarianism, and it seems true to me, but I haven't studied ethics enough, because if you start out being utilitarian, you soon realize that like evaluating every situation isn't practical. So in practice, you have to like come up with, okay, what are the rules I'm going to follow in each kind of situation? And also, if you start out as the ontologist, it's like, okay, but how do you pick your rules? Maybe the rules that leads to maximum good. Does it seem right to you?
I suppose. So let's see. If we, well, yeah, we can go on a little bit on this topic. So let's say utilitarianism, for instance. It's already within this philosophical literature, which I'm frankly not super acquainted with, but it's already within the literature that you can have secondary arguments for utilitarianism, meaning that a good heuristic would be you will have greater utilitarian effects if not everybody walks around and tries to maximize pleasure and minimize pain all the time, because then that takes a lot of calculation, and in the end they will make a lot of mistakes, and then you'll end up with a less utilitarian result. And that leads us to the connection between utilitarianism and virtue ethics. And virtue ethics just says, well, this is an honest person, this is a humble person, this is a generous person, for instance. And most of the time, it'll make much more sense on an individual level to just try to be honest, generous, and humble than to hone those as qualities which can be embodied and felt, rather than walk around like a computer the rest of your life and try to calculate your way through every situation you encounter. So yes, there does appear to be a secondary argument there, but on a more fractal level, we zoom out and we view these different forms of meta-ethics. We can see that utilitarianism seems to make sense whenever we've already set the social contract, and the social contract is already in place. We already have set deontological principles which we can agree upon, and we already agree upon which virtues we want to foster in ourselves and one another. And then we use our collective intelligence on an aggregate level to calculate what is good and bad. And that's where utilitarianism comes in, right?
I have a bit of a different question, if that's okay. So I know that, a lot of summaries of metamodernism coming from other thinkers emphasize oscillation, and you touched on that a bit. How do you see your set of definitions sitting with this idea of like oscillation as this primary thing, go forth and oscillate? And I particularly bring it up because I had encountered metamodernism previously, and this oscillation thing, I was like, okay, well, that's interesting, but I don't really feel a big grab on it. And it wasn't until coming across, oh, this developmental approach that I was like, oh, okay, there's something here. So how do you see those views sitting?
Yeah, so obviously there is a bit of a conflict because it's a contested term. It's part of why. Well, first of all, hello, Henry. It's good to meet you. We haven't had the pleasure.
Indeed.
We've interacted quite a lot before. I mean, well, I'm basically with you there that to me, I don't really skip a lot of heartbeats over just the principle of oscillation. And if I hadn't known about integral theory and that kind of take on what comes after postmodernism, I probably wouldn't have been super interested in metamodernism as such. I would have, tucked it away as one more interesting idea, right? The point is that I felt that if you enrich that oscillation and that metamodernism as a cultural phase with these other meanings, with an underlying deeper engine of a new philosophy that is emerging across the board, with a view of developmental stages, and yes, there is indeed a metamodern and developmental stage, and so on, it appears to fit reasonably well in that it jives with this principle of both and thinking. And I thought, in Wilbur you have this both and thinking, and that's also what I inherited. Now, what I found with the metamodernists who had written about this term earlier, and from simply the perspective of a cultural phase, the arts, and so on, they had a richer language for it, which better caught the vibe, so to speak. They came up with magical realism, with oscillation, with form naivety, with sincere irony. And there was a lot to play with there. And what I felt, it was very integral. No, it was very metamodern. So I felt, they were culturally much more on the beat with something that, I felt would be salient and sustainable, culturally sustainable in our day and age. So I felt if you take that metamodernism stuff and you put it in integralism and vice versa, you can get the best of both worlds. Particularly, you get a kind of design intervention in integralism, which had many weaknesses, but one of them was aesthetic. That metamodernism had all these corny, these very new agey images, and it just doesn't speak to most people. It particularly just speaks to the people who can relate to those spiritual experiences that are being portrayed. And by the way, it also has a difficulty living up to it because it's not ironic enough in its presentation of itself, which also makes it prone to all of these cases of hysteria, where people overinvest in gurus and so on.
Yeah. And cast postmodernism green as the central adversary. Yes. I think, integral has its own aesthetic, and I agree that metamodernism and particularly sincere irony, I think, is one of the things that grabs me a lot. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. How you got to that particular synthesis.
And thanks, Henry. It's just sometimes I like superposition better. So, but at the same time, I feel ashamed using it because I don't know so much about quantum theory.
I know what you mean.
But superposition, two things are entangled. They're interconnected. It's in two places. There's a non-locality. You can manipulate one thing and the other thing changes. So it's in two places at the same time. And we need to be like, oscillation sounds like you have to hurry back and forth. I like superposition better because it's more static. That you can be deep in the irony, and the deeper you go in the irony, the more sincere you can get. So you can write an outrageous book where you're super where you're super you know, rude and shocking and everything. And because you do that, you open up the space for being very, very, very sincere. This is what I really want. This is what I really feel. These are my real hopes. These are my real concerns. And if I just put those out there, it just joins a million other voices. It doesn't stand out aesthetically. And most of all, it doesn't appear, well, this goes back to postmodernism, really. Postmodernists will always distrust, or at least the dark pomos, not the light pomos, like the Marxist types more, or academic types more. They will distrust any true believer, right?
Right.
So you have to be, and what I kind of found, and not just myself, other people too, was that when you're really deep in the irony, you can become the true believer, just comes in through the back door. And without being tunnel vision, because you're in a tunnel, but it's a fractal tunnel, and it opens you up and closing you down. So that's actually, yeah, superposition is better. But I realize I'm probably making a fool out of myself before.
I'm not qualified to say. So yeah, I like superposition. I also like productive tension, I think, is the way that I think about it. Like, you do have both of them at the same time, and there's an interplay. But yeah, I don't like this going back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And they even actually write this, I think from Molander and Van der Akker, they really write about different islands, which you literally hurry back and forth between. And it sounds like hard work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I also agree that, like, the framing of the listening society sets you up so that by the time you get to the vulnerability of the state and depth chapters, in particular, I found that was like, okay, now we're ready to do a dive in there, and you're primed to accept the vulnerability and sincerity, because you know that Hanzi is in on the joke too, on the ironic joke of the world. So yeah.
I also want to point you, Henry, to Brent Cooper has written a copy.
Thanks, Brent. Thank you, Dana.
Can I ask a question?
Hello, Tim.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, this is my second outing this week online. So you know, I've been a bit of a hermit the last few years, but it's a pleasure to meet you face to face online. And I have to admit, I was at least one notch behind you on the hierarchy of subjective well-being this evening, and you've got me up at least a notch up to your level. So thank you for that, Daniel. My question was, well, I really wanted you to elaborate on something in particular, because most of those 6 forms of metamodernism and metamodernity that you were outlining were to do with answering the question, what's next? But Hanzi picks up on another Greek word, to do with the metaxis, and in other words, what's in between, the kind of concept of in-betweenness. So I was hoping you might just be able to elaborate on the importance of the metaxic as well as meta, in terms of going beyond and saying what's next.
Great pleasure to meet you also, Tim. Another person I have interacted with a lot and never had the pleasure to meet. Yes, first of all, ataxia and so on is a stronger theme in the cultural theorist metamodernists. So ataxia, metanoia, and Brent Cooper has done actually more work, and he'd perhaps like to say a few words about it as well. I notice he's here. Just my own 2 cents. They look at metamodernism more in this term, like essence, and that in-betweenness, a transition, and so on. And in-betweenness is a very important part of any relational philosophy, which we could have also put up there with Metamodern Philosophy term. I feel that it also makes sense to talk about what the next stage that we want to construct looks like. That being said, we are in betweenness right now, like we've never been before. We're in 10 different types of in-betweenness at once. So it is important. And just to say something about the particular historical moment, all of this relates to different theories of change, of course. The most prominent one is, well, perhaps the Berkana Institute theory of change, which says that one paradigm, one big system matures, and then you see many little inventions of alternatives showing up, and as the other one starts to crash under its own weight, then it becomes more pressing. It becomes more pressing for these new agents to take more and more responsibility, connect with each other, and all of their work begins to congeal, and they learn from best experiences and so on. One thing goes down, the other thing goes up, right? And we're in the steep fall of modernity, and then we're in the rise of something new. I would call it metamodernity. And postmodernism then is not in itself a stable phase; it's a critique of modernity, and it showed up under modernity's, let's say, technological regime, whereas metamodernism is particularly an internet phenomenon, and particularly linked to that social logic, which is probably the social logic of the future. So that's one way of seeing it. Another way, which I in many ways prefer, is that history evolves in movement and institution. And so it goes back to sociologist Alberoni, Alberto Alberoni or something, and he says, well, that institutions eventually crumble, and then there's this moment of just rejoicement and joy where everything is up in the air, and it's like falling in love. Everything becomes liquid for a while before it congeals again. But there is also a sociological theory called revolution and counter-revolution by Seymour Lipset. And the counter-revolution is the reaction to the revolution, because the revolution, given that it doesn't build on established structures, it contradicts a lot of the social orders, and it doesn't build on a lot of experience. So it's prone to failure and overreaction and all of other, well, just mistakes, just a lot of mistakes. So when the revolution does go wrong, which it inevitably does, and which is kind of what has happened with our postmodern critique of society, there is a counter-reaction, just like after the French Revolution. Like in the early days of the French Revolution, people were walking around naked downtown, literally, and having sex with whoever, and like things were crazy. And after a while, heads start rolling and wars erupt, and then boom, the old order reestablishes itself, reacts very strongly, is strongly reactionary. It throws out all of that new garbage, whatever that was, and tries to continue where things were. But they've also picked up a bit of the social dynamics of the new world. So eventually, though, it is when the counter-reaction or when the counter-revolution is defeated on its own terms, because it never has, it doesn't look towards a new equilibrium state. It doesn't look towards the future attractors. So inevitably, it's doomed. But it's going to win first to the excesses of the revolution. And right now we're in that counter-revolution, which is what we're seeing across Europe, in the United States, in world politics at large, and also in the cultural dynamics of our day and age. And it's often during the counter-revolution that the worst atrocities are committed, unfortunately. So we're looking probably towards a fairly grim time, which makes our seeding forms that we come up with now and try out now all the more important for the time when they have matured and the counter-revolution has run out of fuel and shown that it doesn't actually produce a much better society. Yeah, that's kind of the in-betweenness, historically speaking, that I feel we're in right now. So we're in fairly dark times. Hopefully that brings everybody down a notch again in subjective state.
I've gone up to 13.
Brent, do you want to say something on metaxy and metamodernism and stuff? You've written a lot more about it than I have.
Sure, thanks. I like your presentation. You should include me in there somewhere. No, one thing I like to kind of introduce, kind of an injunction, right, is like these missed sources that I dug up, like Borgman and oh God, I forget their names. There's several though, the 3 or 4 from the 90s particular, and a couple from the 2000s that just aren't touched on. And then, my recent article on hypermodernism, right? I pivot that way because it's this parallel discourse. And let's say Vermeulen and Van den Acker were aware, and they just chose not to pursue any of that, right? I think that's a mistake. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. So it begs the question of today, how we all came to this topic, right? And discuss it without this prior context. And it's not a bad thing. It actually expands, becomes more fractal because we get this new research, and it dovetails with the idea of historicity, which is in both metamodernism and hypermodernism. So we get to examine the past 30 years as a period, right? Post-Cold War is when both of these phases really began. And then, of course, it's more crystallized after 2000 with the internet and 9/11. So I think these have been missing pieces of the puzzle. But of course, like Daniel's framing is very comprehensive, excellent kind of 6-dimensional meta theory, pretty hard to undermine that. It's very robust. But I try to historicize it, right? And also problematize the way people come to metamodernism and misunderstand it, as you touched on, right? And so there's different people with different ideologies that they're still they're trying to level up and trying to get away from these past ideologies or political alliances, but they're still trapped by it. So yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to kind of unpack, but if anyone has any questions on that, I can go deeper.
Yeah, thanks, Brent.
Well, I had a thought coming up while in your lecture when you mentioned autopoiesis, right, as one of those engines. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, of the relationship between metamodernism and autopoiesis, if there's any? How does it play out? Because that's a fairly interesting concept in general. And you get my question.
Yeah. So first of all, I'd like to make a caveat that I'm not necessarily a huge subscriber to autopoiesis as it's often used, namely as self-organization, to be contrasted with engineering and control. Because I think that might be a bit of a false dichotomy. If you zoom out, we're never quite out of self-organization. Of course, you have agents in the world, they try to control themselves and their environment. That's engineering, but if you crisscross all of those different perspectives and all those different agencies, you do have a self-organization. The point is that the self-organization can land on stable equilibria, like a functional ecosystem, or it can have some agents taking too much control and not having feedback processes which regulate them back into what is good for the wholeness. So, for instance, human beings get super much control after we develop all these technologies and organize ourselves into modern states. And then we make, huge irrigation projects and whatnot, which then disconnect from the self-organization that exists in local communities, and also might fail to integrate the systems of nature. And so they're huge failures sometimes and cause incredible damage. So that's, I mean, that kind of takes the both and there, that yes, there is a critique against engineering, social engineering included, but at the same time, we can never fully disentangle the two concepts of agency and planned engineering, which just means manipulating one's environment and oneself, and self-organization. There's not like this pure innocent autopoiesis and this evil control freak of an engineer. On the other hand, what does exist are feedback loops which are too slow or too disconnected, so that things fall out of autopoiesis in terms of a certain unit of analysis, for instance, an ecosystem. So right now, humanity has is a species on Earth, among many others, and we have self-organized in societies, but the feedback processes from nature are too slow, so we don't regulate back when we harm nature, because it harms us back too slowly and too irregularly for us to naturally regulate back. And then we have to make forecasts about the environment and start talking about it, but our whole institutions and so on, and habits and way of life are entirely disconnected from that feedback process. So that being said, yes, metamodernism as a sentiment and also as a philosophy, looking at complex systems, self-organization, looking at multiple perspectives, looking at emergencies and processes, or having those as its DNA, as it were, it lines up with autopoietic theories such as, we should identify with a deeper perspective, with a wider perspective, or a range of wider perspectives, so that we include animal rights and the ecos and the biosphere, so that we can become a constructive part of Gaia's expression rather than a cancer on Lovelock's Gaia system, for instance. And also in terms of organization, then, you will try to maximize the autonomy of and the sovereignty of each individual, and then each enclave, and then each part of the organization, and you'll try to link them to as many other relevant stakeholders as possible, so that it doesn't get trampled by the hierarchy of the organization, and which is an autopoietic sentiment or principle. But to get to autopoiesis, you have to be fairly engineering. You have to take up you have to be playful. You have to make suggestions, and this is a difference then between a postmodern sentiment, which could still be aligned with autopoiesis as a kind of as viewed as kind of Rousseau impurity principle, versus we're always part of autopoiesis, and our engineering attempts, including social engineering attempts, become naive, informed naivety, become proto-synthesis. Like we know that these suggestions might not work, but we have to try them because we have to develop together, right?
Right. Yes, I mean this, and of course, I was thinking about autopoiesis as an intrinsically connected part to psychology, and autopoiesis of consciousness and developmental stages, you know, because you can't really think developmental stages up to a point without thinking about autopoiesis and how the consciousness works and the psychology. And so, like, even in simple models like Keegan and self-authorship and self-transformation, so there's like this element of autopoiesis come into play, and how we use our consciousness, you know, and it's like, it's very, very similar to metamodernism as a psychological stage, isn't it?
Yes, I do believe it is. And actually, when we look at the different metamemes as when we look at metamodernism as a metameme, it's a certain cultural generator function. So it generates culture of a certain kind, or just actually the same is true of postmodernism. So for instance, look at the painting over there. It's not impressive. I made it a bunch of years ago. Nevertheless, you can look at it and see that, is this painting from the 1700s? And you can just answer no. And it doesn't have anything to do with my developmental stage as an artist. It's just the fact that I live in a postmodern world. So flattening things up and making a dreamy symbolical landscape, which is maybe a sea, maybe not, maybe a moon, maybe a sun, who knows. And there's a lot of expressed emotion in it, even though it's not very well expressed. That very thing couldn't be conceived if you're not in the postmodern generator function. And this is, so they are kind of autopoietic systems in and of themselves as generator function. And the same goes, I believe, but I can't prove it, for how our mind works. Meaning that, well, so let's say somebody has 1,000 different propositions that they believe in, which link up together, and they all support one another, at least partly, and they together they make up a postmodern worldview. Along comes your metamodern friend and says a metamodern proposition, and it contradicts 1,000 presuppositions that you already have. So your gravity just pulls it down and falsifies it. It's just like, there's no way this one can be true, because then all of these 1,000 different things that I already believe would not be true. Rather than for the self-organizational system of the mind to shift, you have to shift 500 or more of those little nodes or stars on your sky into new constellations, and then they link up, and then they start, because the mind is always a process, always doing things, and then they start doing things in new patterns, and that's a self-organization. And interestingly then, I don't know if others have noticed this, but when I talk to you guys, for instance, and a select crowd like this one, the words just kind of flow. You know, you just ask me all sorts of difficult questions. I come up with some kind of answer, and I kind of feel supported by, like, just the vibe I'm in, by the presuppositions of the crowd. Well, then I go down to, I don't know, my old colleagues at the university or my family, and try to explain just something I view differently, and I just can't find the words, right? Because, well, transpersonal perspective, right? But that, like, I don't have the other points to link to. I can, you know, I can tinker a little bit with 1 or 2 points and say, wouldn't it be interesting if, or blah, blah, blah. But by and large, I'll find I have a whole, like, other part of me which just doesn't, there's a barrier I can't breach, and I can't go past it, and I just can't speak. And even if we go deep into discussions, I can't come up with anything to say. And that would be metamodern. So then I'll stay within a postmodern or modern mindset, and I'll also not be able to think the thoughts while I'm going there, a little bit, but the thoughts will be farther away from me. So they're also transpersonal. They're also in the field, so to speak, right? Which, again, I mean, speaks a lot to this thing about viewing metamodernism as a movement. That as a movement on a deep level, even though we're not calling it metamodernism necessarily, and there are all these interconnected dots that don't seem to have much in common, nevertheless, you can enter into these different fields and kind of interact a lot along this self-organizational logic that you experience. And also the embodiment becomes different. You just become a different person, like your metamodern self or whatever, which is also a big part of why I had to isolate myself, writing the books, by the way, just to get away from all the gravity that where I couldn't access that stuff, right?
Well, as your neurology goes into a bit of a stress response, if you're surrounded by this different perspective, you know that things aren't going to land the right way.
Yeah, I guess that could be a big part of it. I mean, hey, I wish I was a bigger person than that and could live up to, well, that's just more perspectives, and yeah. Let's play with it. But oftentimes I do feel a bit of distance, and well, as you age, of course, you learn to live with it, and then you accept that for what it is, and then you find, well, there are many ways to relate to other people. And once you've kind of had your fill with metamodern code and culture and so on, then it becomes more okay that people are just different and we have different settings to be in, right?
Yeah, I'm also thinking a bit in the cultural somatics frame of kind of what kind of attachment is there between the emerging metamodern culture and the postmodern or modern cultures, and it's not a secure relationship at this point, right? There's not enough of an established base, particularly if you're outside of your supportive context, to really have that kind of secure attachment neurological relationship with a different cultural context around you right now. And that's, I don't know, as you know, I'm very fascinated by this cultural somatics frame, and like what kind of cultural interactions can be modeled that way.
Yes, I agree, and I think that this was something I was talking to Jim Rutt with on his podcast, and this connects back to this fourth age, the Hermetics, right? Mm-hmm. That there's a particular role for this category within the metamodernists, and they're a little less outward bound. So hipsters engage with all kinds of stuff around them, as do, of course, hackers and hippies as well. Whereas introvert types are often a little bit more the Hermetics, and they have a particular role to play when it comes to creating, well, metamodern temples where we can charge our batteries, as it were, culturally, and embody stuff better, and just kind of feel supported by a community and culture, which feels a little bit esoteric, but just a little bit, just ironically esoteric, right? You shouldn't actually have anything to hide, right?
But but sometimes it helps to have a space.
Yeah, and some interesting rituals, and these can be reinvented like continually, but we need to probably, as a movement, become better at that. And I'm optimistic that I see more and more of this tendency. At the same time, of course, it's a fairly dangerous path to walk, because hey, then you get into all the stuff like well, esoteric stuff, basically, when stuff that's difficult to explain to other people, psychedelic practices, not least, and this this creates this can also create a chasm, and actually also slides into things that that are connected to esotericism and occultism. For instance, far-right thinking, where you feel like, whoa, I felt this strong energy, so let's make this strong energy take over society. Not a good idea.
Yeah, yeah. I find some hopeful things in the immersive theater scene, the interactive theater festival practices that are pretty big here in San Francisco, or were when we could run off and have big interactive groups of people running around in costumes and storylines. But that's kind of a supportive ritual that seems to, it brings in both the irony and the sincerity. You know, it's people looking for authentic connection, but in the context of some sort of crazy plot line that we've all agreed is real for the weekend. That's the kind of place where I see some ritual possibilities emerging.
This appears to be a recurring theme, actually, so that's interesting. I noticed you were waving, Michael.
Yeah, I was more curious about, you said, like, when you show up in a setting like this as your metamodern self, and stuff I've been noticing, certainly now that we're doing in digital contest on a screen in Zoom here, but still you can summon your metamodern self when you are in the presence of faces you think are metamodern. And what's going on there, really? I've been noticing it all summer and fall when I'm in certain Zoom calls. I just show up as a more me.
So I think Henry might have said part of it, that well, if we feel that what we're going to say isn't going to be super well understood, and maybe what we feel, also when we feel the kind of expression that we're making is going to be misunderstood and misrepresented, then we get a little bit nervous, and nervous shuts down complex processes, right? So that on a very simple and visceral level, that could be it. But the other part I really think is like, well, we're social beings, we're interactive beings, so that, like, you say something, it prompts me to do something. Yeah, like a dance or whatever, right? So you will throw me balls, which for me aren't curved balls. I can catch them, they make sense to me. I feel I can play with it. We get in a more playful mood, and like there are enough presuppositions shared for like a breakdown of the conversation not to be imminent every 20 seconds. We help each other to stretch our minds into more complex modes of thinking and being. And now, of course, the critique against this is that when we stretch our minds into more complexity, we also disembody a little bit, because hey, then we're in our heads. And I have to say, I'm not that scared of disembodiment for a little while here and there, right? Because, well, I mean, sure, if you get stuck in it and you get less sensual or less sexual or less alive or something, then that's a problem, of course. Or you forget to tune in your feelings and all of that. But for a while, it's okay to be in our heads and play with ideas. And then it's an inherent tension in metamodernism, that because we're trying to go very, very complex, and we're trying to go, spiritually deep and high, and here actually the word oscillate, Henry, might be better. We inherently have to be good at oscillating between these. Ideally, we could get into quantum superposition. Sorry, Linda. Linda wrote in the chat that she will explain what it actually means at some point. But ideally, we could really be in both, and maybe in the future, we as individuals and we together will be capable of that. Integralism claimed to be that, but in many ways it failed, particularly on the complexity and the stringency side, and depth and community and communion would trump stringent thought and clarity and complexity, right? So we have to be defenders of both of these sides, I guess, and that's, I guess, that's a part of the tension that never leaves us, that even when we are together, right?
I think, Daniel, if I could just come back to my question on I've even forgotten what my question was. The in-betweenness in relation to what you're, the metaxy in relation to what you're saying now, because I think behind my question, I've sort of got it into my head that somebody who's kind of metamodern is likely to have a greater facility for kind of operating at different levels, engaging with different codes, and even mediating between people who might come from, different ends of the spectrum almost. And that can, in my personal experience, that can be quite a dangerous situation. I mean, not that I'm setting myself up as the next Messiah to be crucified, but if you're kind of playing, it's not a game, but playing, being in between for the sake of kind of sharing things that are going to be received by people, it can be quite dangerous.
Agreed, but so are all other positions. So what we argue in Nordic ideology is that metamodernists are going to win in the long run, and they're the opposite of populists, because populists they go for low complexity and thus towards the lowest common denominator. So a lot of people are bothered by the presence of a lot of new Arabs in Swedish society, so the Populist Party are going to say, well, how about not Arabs? Stuff like that, right? Whereas metamodernists go in the opposite direction and say, hey, we're going to do so complex stuff and be so nuanced, we're going to bore you all to tears. We're not going to be wanting to listen to us, so they'll always only attract, in terms of votes or popular support, a lower portion. But because these processes that are created in metamodern circles and so on manage greater complexity, they also manage to imbue more perspectives. And then they can traverse what others view as flat scales, or one-dimensional scales, or two-dimensional scales, and they can walk through the third dimension and pop out on different places. And as such, they can have more weak ties, and that's a powerful theory in network theory, that weak ties can help out a lot. And in those weak ties, they can always offer interesting counter perspectives. So a person on the right will get interesting tips on how to counter postmodern arguments, for instance. A person on the left will get interesting critiques into the psychology of the right, and so on. As such, they can be a little bit friends with a lot of people, and as such, they can have bridging functions. And they're going to then be viewed as, well, a bit too meek, a bit too wobbly, a bit unprincipled. They're going to be never be anyone's favorite, but they're likely to be the least hated alternative. So like left are going to hate them a little bit less than they hate libertarians. Libertarians can hate them a little bit less than they hate the left, and so on. So and this is also a theory in network science of the strength of non-negative ties. Because you then build the greatest wealth of non-negative ties, you garner the greatest concentration of perspective taking and the greatest capability of coordinating perspectives. Then the chances are that fairly small groups can influence society a lot. By means of having this unique position. What I would like to see happen in the world, what isn't happening yet, is for the creative class or the quadruple H population to become more conscious of themselves as a class and society, which are distinct from the interests of the middle class. Middle class want more or less to keep the status quo. And so actually does the working class in many ways. I mean, some redistributions, differences, and so on. But then the metamodern quadruple H class have a distinct class interest in a more deeply free society where you are liberated to go off and do your crazy projects and experiments, which are highly likely to fail, but in accumulation can and will save the world, right? But the middle class won't have it. They don't want to pay for that with their tax money in terms of UBI and so on. And then there is a alliance then between metamodernists and the creative class, but also the precariat, the people who don't fit in the categories of worker, entrepreneur, and so on. So there's of course a revolving door. If you live a risky life with a creative class, you can land in precarity. This happened to a lot of us. And then what both of these groups need is a more listening society, which empowers sovereignty and doesn't let you spend your unemployed days making all of those applications and jumping in so many hoops from the authorities and the companies. I do see a separate class interest there, which is orthogonal to the classical scale, and I think that before it has gotten its support structures, it feels a lot more dangerous, but actually it's one of the less dangerous positions in society, because when push comes to shove and things, there is a lot of turmoil, we'll have allies and friends and perspectives a bit more all over the place, which, I mean, the chameleon is often safe, and the octopus is often safe, right?
Yeah, can I just ask you a bit more about the precariat that you mentioned there? Because I mean, if you follow Guy Standing's analysis, he's talking about the development of a kind of class consciousness there, but three very disparate groups in society, in Western society, that are actually tend to be antagonistic towards each other. So you've got the descendants of the traditional working class, you've got ethnic minority immigrants, and you've also got kind of highly educated younger people who don't find any employment commensurate with their kind of, their levels of complexity. So what you're saying now about a kind of quadruple H class consciousness developing, I'm just interested to know how that would help what Guy Standing's talking about in terms of engaging with the precariat.
Yes, so I realize we're on time, so I'll have to respond very quickly. But I'm not a super fan of Guy Standing's precariat theory, because I don't view it as realistic. I view the fundamental alliance as realistic. And in fact, since he published the book, you haven't seen this new dangerous class emerging, really. What you see on in the COP, like what my sociologist colleagues have studied in their protest studies and demonstration studies, they see that young people show up at these protests and demonstrate, but what we would call POMOs, the postmodern population. I think it's a bit of a left-wing wet fantasy that the working class would align with all of these new immigrants while competing for the same jobs, and at the same time their national identity being perhaps their primary source of pride that they still have if they're less privileged in society. And I also have difficulty seeing these very disparate groups that are the immigrants organizing as such. They tend to organize according to the lines of ethnic ethnicities. And so what I mean rather is that, okay, a lot of us work outside of the norms and habits and functions of the modern labor market. And as such, we have a shared interest with unemployed people and people who don't quite fit in. And this group in itself cannot organize itself for logical reasons, because everybody wants to stop being unemployed and skip out of that hole, right? So rather, it's that if metamodernists and the quadruple H population build a more listening society with basic support structures for everyone, not necessarily a UBI, but other forms that don't have you jumping through all the modern hoops, then there's likely to be a quiet support from somewhere, from the precariat, from the people who would like to be supported in living lives that don't quite fit into the modern framework. And more people are falling into that category due to the pressures of globalization and of course digitization.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. I think we did 2 hours now, and I think that's the perfect point to close this lecture for today. Thank you all for participating and to be here and partake on this discussion. Thank you, Daniel, for taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you will all tune in next time. Our next lectures will be Raoul Eshelman, the creator of the aforementioned performatism. He will come on this program Thursday. You can see that on the Parallax website. So we have a nice lineup coming up. Again, thank you all for participating. I wish you all a very great evening and see you soon.
Bye.